is Harley Dillinger. And if I'm being honest with you, I never much cared for the name, so you can call me Dill. I was born in Eddyville, Iowa. I was one of 13 children, born in 1889. At age 21, I graduated from Highland Park Business College. Unfortunately for me, the Panic of 1910 hit that year. And what that was a series of economic depressions and recessions that affected a lot of good folks. And I was no exception. So I thought the best way to navigate those troubled times was to join the civil service. Problem was, though, there was no work to be found in Des Moines once I had passed the test. So I jumped on a train to California, and I got a clerical job with the Navy at Mare Island. The job was tedious and it didn't pay a whole lot, but I was able to at least scrape something of a living. I stayed there for a year, and then in 1911 I took a similar position with the Forest Service here in El Dorado County. When I arrived here in Placerville, I really felt that I was going to be something, that my fortunes were going to look up. And then at a Valentine's Day dance in 1912, they really did look up. I met Alice Little Johnston. After a year of courtship, we got married. We would have 2 children, our daughter Marion and our son William. We would buy a house in downtown Placerville and we would live the rest of our lives there. Now, while working for the Forest Service, I always kept my eyes open for the right opportunity. And then in 1916, local businessman Charles Perry Winchell was selling out. And I thought, here was my chance to show what I could do as a businessman. I borrowed some money and then took some classes to better understand just what it was I was getting into. You see, Mr. Winchell was in the furniture and funeral business. Now I know what you might be thinking. Furniture shop, funeral home. How do those two worlds work? Well, back in my day, it was quite common, and even more so in the 19th century. For you see, back then, families, when their loved ones passed on, they would display them in the parlor of their homes for a period of mourning before burying them, usually on the family property. Now, you needed something to lay your loved one in, and so families looked to carpenters to build coffins. And carpenters also built furniture. So that's how those two fields worked initially. And then as that century wore on, homes would become smaller and parlors would become scarce. So what furniture shops did was they set a separate room in their shop aside for families to view their loved ones before burial. And this room was usually in the back end of the shop, and that was because the embalming fluids they used at the time smelled terrible. And carpenters that worked in those shops, they learned the trade of embalming so they could undertake the task of preparing the dead for the grave. Hence why we have the word undertakers. In fact, that was an official job title that carpenters would take. And I was the latest in the line. Now, as a new businessman, I needed to advertise. So what I had was the church newsletter. And I was active at the Federated Church, which was conveniently a 5-minute walk from my home. And as a new businessman, I needed to get a better foothold with my fellow business owners in that community. And so I did what many businessmen of my time did. We joined fraternal organizations, and I was a member of the Lions Club, the United Ancient Order of Druids, which I was twice Noble Arch on both separate occasions, the Fraternal Order of Eagles, and the Freemasons. Now this section is the Druid section, and I'm buried in my Masonic regalia. And while I enjoyed being a businessman, I still felt that I could do more for my community and do more for folks that I came to call friends. So I took to studying law, and I loved it. And in 1918, I passed this California State Bar exam and I had a new title to my name. Now, initially, I only heard small cases, but I still wanted to do and be more. So that led me to serving on the Placerville City Council, which I even had a stint as mayor at one point. And it was during that time that I acquired a taste for politics. And so I felt the next step was the state assembly. I ran in 1924 and got elected and would serve there until 1932. Then in 1940, thanks to the good folks here of El Dorado County, as well as Alpine and Amador counties, elected me to the state senate. I was a registered Democrat who always voted his conscience. But the one issue that was always on my mind throughout my political career was water issues. Coming to this community, I came to understand the rich farming history that we had here. I also understood that we didn't get rain for much of the year. Gone were the days that farmers that had used trenches built by the prospectors of the gold rush era to funnel water from the rivers into their crops. Now was the age of the El Dorado Irrigation District, whose main purpose was just that. But the trouble we have as a county that supplies California much of its water, and there's a few of us, is that federal and state authorities always got their hands on the spigot. And then in 1926, the Owens Valley in the eastern part of our state was completely drained of its water by a thirsty Los Angeles, devastating the local economy. And I was afraid we were going to be next. So I authored legislation to see that we could become a county of origin. Therefore, not only meeting our current water needs, but also our future needs as well, before we go sharing that water elsewhere, like Los Angeles. It took some time, but in 1931, we got the Origin of Water Rights Bill passed. Still considered a key landmark piece of legislation in California water rights, it, however, did not solve all of our water problems. We still needed to store that water. And I felt we needed a reservoir. And my thinking was, have one up at Sly Park. You see, there it sits at an elevation where water can just flow down through gravity and not through man-made pumps. I pleaded our case to the California Water Conference in 1945. And then again, I spoke to it at a House subcommittee in 1948. And what we got as part of the Central Valley Project was Jenkinson Lake, a reservoir that sits at Sly Park. And we got Folsom Dam, which not only gives us water storage, but also prevents flooding into Sacramento as well, both that it reached its completions in 1955. And another highlight of my political career, did you folks know that Lake Tahoe was once known as Lake Bigler? That was named so in honor of our third governor, John Bigler. Bigler was the first governor to serve 2 full terms, and he was so well liked that the California State Legislature named the lake after him. This was in the 1850s. And then in the years following the Civil War, the federal government took issue with the name. And that is because Bigler was a supporter of the Confederacy. And you can imagine that as California being a Union state during the Civil War, that the federal government would have a problem with something being named for a Confederate supporter. So what the federal government did was they rewrote their maps and named the lake a deviation from a Washoe word, which they thought meant water that sits in a high place. The actual word itself in the Washoe language just means lake. But the California legislation at that time refused to acknowledge it. In fact, For decades, it was a big tug of war going on, if you will, over what the name of the lake was going to be. That was until 1945 when I authored the formal legislation to recognize Lake Tahoe as the name we know it today. Now in 1952, I decided it was time to retire from politics. And then I took up a new passion. Let me ask you all something. Ĉu vi parolas Esperanton? Do you speak Esperanto? Esperanto was a created language done so in the late 1800s by a Polish ophthalmologist by the name of Ludwik Zamenhof. He believed that through one single language, that the cultures of the world could build a better understanding of one another, thus come together and prevent war. And having lived through 2 world wars, I saw the potential. The problem I had, though, was textbooks at the time were terrible. They were either lacking in information or they just had bad information. And when you're passionate about teaching a subject, but the textbooks just won't do, what does one do in that case? You author your own is what you do. And I published this in 1960. And I taught Esperanto both here in Placerville and down in Sacramento until my death in 1969. Now, unfortunately, Esperanto has not enjoyed the popularity that I hoped it would, but it does comfort me to know that there are 60,000 people in the world that use it as a second language. And there are organizations dedicated to the advancement of the language as well. Well, folks, I thank you all for coming and hearing my story. I wish you all good health, or as I would say in Esperanto, mi deziras al vi bonan sanon. Thank you and have a wonderful day.